Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Everyone, thank you for joining us. I'm here with two of my guests. The rest will appear, I guarantee you. I've got them right now on text. But to my right-hand side here, I've got Tom Ulanowski. Tom, could you help me pronounce your last name? Yeah, please help me.
It's Tom Ulanowski.
Tom, thank you so much for coming and giving us your time. Tom is, are you head of extraction for Nextleaf, Tom, or what's your official title?
Quality assurance person and responsible person, and I've been with the company since the start.
That's right. So he's pretty much at the ground level. We got Ryan coming back for a second visit. Ryan Lee, all the way at the other side of the screen. Ryan, thank you for coming as well. So much.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So today's discussion is one that I think all three of us have been itching to have for a very long time. I know a lot of the people online that follow us have been really, really amped up about hearing us talk about this subject matter because so much has been said, especially in the past few months, with a couple of people dropping the ball, a couple of also COAs that have come out that seem impossible to attain. So a lot of debate happening online that's really important to tackle right now. We have an amazing crowd today. A lot of people have shown up. I thank all of the attendees today. Remember that if you stay until the end of today's session, you get a chance to win a free tuition to our Living Soil at Home course. So please hang in there. It's not going to be too boring, I promise you. It's going to be an engaging evening. So without further ado, remember the rules to the game, everyone, okay? We're going to start going through some key terms and through some questions, but the public is encouraged to, at all times, ask us questions. We'll stop, we'll engage what you're talking about, and we're going to have a two-way conversation. That's what this is about, live interactive education, okay? So hopefully my slides are on the screen and everybody can see this. These are my two compadres that are not here right now. Julie, who's at home with a new baby, and Mike, who is too busy to show up today. He's taking care of the plants, as he should be. Next, just remember, we're here to inspire mindful cannabis appreciation through product knowledge, science, and cultural awareness. We're trying to deliver some interactive cannabis experiences to you, educational experiences, because we think that this is what's lacking in the industry. A lot of book learning is great, but if you don't talk to people that have the experience of putting the book knowledge into practice, you're going to have some gaps in your learning, okay? We hope to improve industry standards through this. Today's agenda is starting with key terms, okay? And we're going to rely a lot. I mean, I've worked in a lab, but Tom has more extensive experience, and Ryan has worked in laboratories for longer than I think both of us put together. Ryan he's been around in laboratories before testing was available for me here in Canada. I think 2001, you were already doing this kind of stuff, weren't you, Ryan? Already into it.
Yeah, well, I was in school back then, so I had access to some equipment back then with more learning techniques. But yeah, I bought a GC pretty early, and we built the lab in California and a couple in Europe. So we've done a fair amount of testing.
So right now he dropped that term, GC. A lot of us I know are going to be confused right now. Don't worry. Our first section is all about key terms. Next section, we're doing a testing error flow chart. Not just error, though. We're also going to elucidate how things can go the right way. Group discussion to close. So here we go. Without further ado, everyone. I am going to mention very quickly, because we have a tradition here at Chronicles. Ryan, I noticed that you're tasting something. You know that I'm puffing on my black hole right now, which is my garlic cross derivative from the GMO line. Ryan, what are you tasting right now? What are you enjoying?
I've got these dabs that are essentially a mix of three plants. One of the terpinolene dominant plant.
Oh.
That's the parent of one of my seed lines called Schnazelberry, and then it's got a chem, which has a series of rare volatiles that are scent molecules non-related to terpenes, and so it gives it a really unique flavor.
When you say chem, you mean a derivative from the chem dog line?
Yeah, I think it's chem D. This one was the chem D. Yeah.
That's so cool, man, because I also find the THCV spikes and the spike on terpenoline specifically a lot off of those lines that I've always thought probably had a little bit of Himalayan in them. You know, it's got a little bit of that weird profile, that weird nose that's cushy, but not quite kush. You know, it's like something else, right? It's like more sweet. It's a sweet gas that I love so much. So that's awesome. Our public out there, if you, anybody out there is tasting something in their region that they're really enjoying, it's a good time to plug it into the chat group because all of us want to know what's hot out there. Again, I'm crazy on the GMO. Ryan's doing some chem dog mixes. Tom is being very well behaved. So, and he's a father, so he should be.
It's a work day, and I have a small child at home, so I will imbibe a later date and time.
That's what I like to hear. That's what I like to hear. Okay, so everyone, we're going to dive right into our material because we have a lot to go over. What we're going to be talking about today is primarily COAs, certificates of analysis. And we're very interested in understanding how we arrive to those figures, okay? And by the way, I also love that whistler from Rockstar Whistler, but it's a little bit too expensive for me, Amanda. I'll just say that much. I love that. I love it. But $70 on the 8th? What the? Anyway, I'll just say that much. I'll leave it at that. It's great flower, but ouch. Now, chromatography. I think I'm going to hand this one off to you, Tom, because you put in some illustrations as well. Why don't you tackle this one for us?
Sure, yeah. So chromatography is fundamentally the separation science. And so whether that's done on liquids or gases, using a high pressure or high performance liquid chromatography or gas chromatography, the goal is the same. You have a complex mixture or a cocktail, your sample that you get. You would prepare that sample depending on the analysis you're doing. And then you use chromatography by exploiting the different chemical properties of the solutes of interest. So let's just say THC or CBD, you're interested in analyzing that and quantifying that or figuring how much of that is in a sample. So you would inject that into a chromatography system. And then based on the differential interactions between the solute, the mobile phase, and the stationary phase, you're able to separate those things throughout a column. And at the end, using certain standards and different, kind of quality control measures, you're able to quantify or hopefully accurately, be able to tell how much of that solute or solutes of interest is in your molecule. And so here's an example, a very, very simple example of an HPLC, high performance or high pressure liquid column chromatography setup. Gas chromatography is very similar, used primarily for terpenes. You would just replace that HPLC column with a much longer gaseous column. So it's a pretty simple process. You take a sample of something. You prep that sample typically by performing an extraction in a centrifuge tube or something small. You do a series of dilutions of that and filtrations, and then you inject that sample into your chromatography system. So you run a set of calibration standards, some blanks, some duplicates, some secondary check standards, and then you basically run this through the system. And I think the best metaphor that I like to use for chromatography, when you're talking about these chromatographic columns, you can basically envision that they're filled with a stationary phase with different chemistry. And just imagine, a bunch of little hands kind of grabbing onto different things. And a good metaphor is if you're walking down a hallway at school with your friends, you might be quite a popular person and have a lot of interactions with people. And as you're walking, you're delayed through that hallway. Much like THC might have a lot of interactions with that stationary phase, whereas maybe your friends are less popular and they just kind of go through that hallway quicker. So at the end, you're separating each other out. And then you have these distinct peaks. You take it through a detector, typically could be something as a spectrophotometer, which is just shining light at a specific wavelength. Those molecules absorb, you get a signal. Those peaks are not nice chromatography peaks. You would typically see really nice sharp peaks. And the area under the curve is the signal. You compare that to your standard, and you're able to do some math and some calculations and figure out what's in your original sample. So it's a very powerful technique. You can change temperature, solvents, column chemistry, detectors. You can do a mass spec detector to get a little more powerful detector, but ultimately it's a very universally used system, and pretty much every lab uses HPLC or ultra high pressure chromatography to do a cannabinoid analysis.
Okay, that was a highly technical explanation, and I thank you enormously for that, Tom. That was awesome, and the analogy was sick, man.
Yeah.
I
hope it works for some people. Yeah.
I couldn't have thought of that. That's all I'm saying. Like, there's no way in hell I could have figured that one out. Is there anything you'd like to add, Ryan, before I move on?
Well, no, I mean it's an excellent, excellent explanation from a chemist perspective. I'm, you know, I wonder if it's over the head of some of the people in the audience. I mean, to me,
probably.
I just wanted to kind of, you know, boil it down into like a simple analogy.
Yeah.
Think of it like making soup stock or bone stock, right? You have your liquid, which is the solvent. You put all your stuff, all your ingredients in the stock, and you boil it, and that extracts the flavors and all the different compounds. And that's kind of like what we're doing when we do an extraction with cannabis. We put the flowers in a liquid solvent, and we extract the components which end up containing the cannabinoids and the terpenes. And we then sift out the plant material, and that solution with all the components in it is what gets injected into the machine. And so you can think of the HPLC machine or even gas chromatography like a sift. It kind of separates those molecules out by size, but like Tom was also saying, also using their chemical properties, how well they stick to other things in the column. And so really what it does is it stretches it out. And Tom's going to put up an image pretty soon that shows a gas chromatography, a chromatograph. Here it is here on the chromatograph. And I just want people to pay attention to that bottom line. That bottom line, the units are actually a measurement of time. So when we see these peaks coming out, what we're actually are these different peaks, these different little kind of, I don't know, like little curves that stick out from the line. Those represent the volume of a given component of that extraction that we've done on the flowers. I use the analogy of, you know, we cram like a bunch of these molecules down a very thin tube, and it's kind of like, you know, going to the water park, you know, and going down those water slides. If you have a really small guy, he's going to come out of the tube first, whereas like someone that's a little bit larger and taller, they'll get stuck along the way going down the tube, and so they actually come out later.
Yeah.
So we can use this separation science to like separate the cannabinoids from the terpenes and even the cannabinoids from one another. You can see based on the graph here on the right, there's a whole list of different cannabinoids that are in the plant, but they actually come out at a different, what we call retention time. So that bottom line really represents, you know, how long it took for the molecule to get to the machine through the machine. And because the machine is able to separate them like that, we can then quantify them by these methods that Tom has been talking about.
Yeah, and that's a great point there, a few points there. And if you look at this chromatogram on the left of your screen, you'll notice that there's actually no way for us to tell without any calibration standards what peak is related to what, right? Because this is a universal detector which just shows you the absorption or maybe fluorescence in certain methods of a certain molecule, right? So it doesn't tell you anything about the exact quantity or what it is unless you have reference standards that you buy from you know, chemical suppliers that are 99+% pure. And if you run them through the system, you'll be able to compare the peaks and the retention times of your standard to your chromatogram, and then you'll know that at 2.9 minutes, you're going to expect CBG. And every single molecule in here has a slightly different interaction with the column. That's why we get that separation. We want to see that clear separation. And then we take those reference standards and we dilute them and we build a calibration curve. So at the bottom right of your screen, you'll notice there's a calibration curve. And what we do is just vary the concentration in the standards. We might have 3, 5, 7, 9 standards. We build a curve, which is signal versus concentration, which is the area under the curve. And then, of course, we can back calculate by looking at our unknown sample, the area under the curve, compare that to our calibration curve, and then within a very, very, very precise approach, be able to quantify or determine exactly how much of that given solute or chemical is in there. So and just go back there a second. There's also these different terms there: LOD, LOQ, LOL. We'll get to them after. These are called limits of merit. These are basically how well a certain instrument or method can do to or perform in order to do your quantification. So there's a low point where you can't tell the signal from the noise, and there's a limit of linearity where you saturate the detector, but in between you have that dynamic range, and you're able to test anything from a low potency flower to a distillate.
That is the most technical explanation once again I've ever heard, and I thank you personally for that, because you've actually given me more ability to explain it myself. You're really good at it, Tom. Very, 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 very specific. Now, I do want to sort of give people a little bit more of a place to grab onto, because we've given them a pretty concise understanding of how the HPLC column is used in general. Let's say, in as few words as possible, what differentiates these three pieces? Well, not really HPLC. HPLC fits within GC and MS, right? But let's differentiate those two pieces of machinery more than anything, the GC and the MS. And now we've got the GC-MS that actually combines it into a single unit, correct?
Yeah, so Ryan, do you want to take this?
So the HPLC and the GC are really kind of the same part of the machine. That's like the sift. That's the part that separates the compounds. And it really happens by taking, excuse me, either a liquid or a gas and squishing it through a very small tube. And the tube separates them out, like we were talking about before. The next component of the machine is the detector component. So you can kind of think of it like, in the water slide analogy, when the people come flowing out of the bottom of the tube and into the pool, there's a camera that takes a picture of them, or a detector. And that detector is either, it can be different types of things. There's something called a flame ionization detector, or a photodiode array, or this mass selective detector. And all these different detectors, essentially, they take a picture of what's coming out in a different way, and they allow us to either identify the compound in the case of the MS, or like Tom was saying, the computer essentially compares that thing that's coming out of the bottom of the tube to a known standard that we've created, right? So you might take, for example, pure THC, 1 milligram, and put it in 1 milliliter of methanol, and then we inject that into the column, at a separate time when we're not doing the flower, and that when we measure that coming out of the tube, we now know how long it took the THC to get through the column, and because we have a known amount that went through, we can calculate the size of the peak, or we can correlate the size of that peak to our known amount, and that kind of calibrates the scale, right? And so we do this for all the compounds that we're interested in looking at, not only the cannabinoids, but given terpenes as well. And now that allows us to build a library against which the computer can compare samples of unknown mixtures, which we put through, right? Which would be our lab sample. Right.
And as we're getting to those terminologies right now, standards is going to be a repeating theme in this conversation, as well as obviously methods. But the standards and having that point of reference, having that be accurate, is, without that, you can't really get anywhere. Precision and accuracy. Tom, you want to tackle this one for us? How are they different, these two terms, in science? When scientists use them.
Anyone that's taken any, beginner kind of science courses probably has seen this diagram before. There's two terms that are often conflated and quite important for analytical chemistry, and that's precision versus accuracy. So you can see that on the top left of your diagram, we have someone who is accurate, meaning that their bullet holes are hovering around the center, but they're not precise, right? They're not all in the middle. They're kind of spread out in a cloud. Whereas on the right, you have both precision and accuracy, meaning you're aiming at the center and all your bullets are firing and getting really close to the center. So in a lab environment, you need both. You need precision, right? You need repeatability. You need to be able to analyze the same sample 100 times and have that result come out the same. But you also need accuracy. You also need to have that result mean something. Without that accuracy, you have a meaningless result. You can be as precise as possible, but at the end of the day, you need both. So this is just these terms get often conflated. We want precision and accuracy. We're most interested in accuracy, but without precision, you have a random number generator basically.
And that ties right into repeatability. So would either one of you like to tackle this one shortly for us? Yeah.
Just so before I interrupt, is there Daryl or the other gentleman also who want to kind of comment?
Yes.
Well? Yeah.
So currently I'm trying to get Daryl on the line
Okay.
right now. It's kind of why I'm looking down at my phone all the time. And hopefully they will be joining us still. Both of our members of our lab panel, the active people that are actively running laboratories have not shown yet.
Hey guys,
Still crossing my fingers.
this is Daryl here. I'm actually here.
Oh, Daryl, you're
I locked out, but that's
visual is,
okay.
locked
I don't
out.
want to be on this chemistry talk, anyways. It's a little complex for me. I'm not a chemist, so you guys are doing a great job.
Okay.
Daryl, I'm so glad that you're here, and I'm so sorry that we can't see you. So maybe your camera, you need to poke at the camera icon or something.
Don't let me say
But anyway,
something about limitations, but that's okay,
You can
guys.
be
You
a voice.
continue on. You're doing a great job.
you know you can be a voice hovering above us. Don't worry, Daryl. We know that you're there now. That's the good part. Fantastic.
Ryan,
So,
you want to take this one?
No, why don't you pound through all? You're the chemist. You pound through all the technical stuff here, and let's.
Okay.
let's
Yeah.
get regs
killing
going.
it, Tom. Do it.
Sounds good. Sounds good. So repeatability is just a kind of continuation of the previous term, precision. We want to be able to repeat a test within a run or between runs, between days, and have the same result. And that's ultimately the goal. Again, we are not interested in generating random numbers. You know, when you're doing analytical chemistry, you're being highly quantitative and your clients expect that, right? So if you're a lab and I'm a client and I send you 5 samples that are all the same and you give me a huge variation, I'm probably not going to be too happy because it's going to affect things like my regulatory compliance. It's going to give me doubt on how well I'm doing whether I'm growing flower or extracting. Maybe I'm losing things or so it appears. So repeatability is very important in order to have confidence in your data. Without that, again, random number generation.
It's in fact the key. It's the backbone of our industry, not only of the testing industry, but of the cannabis industry as a whole. We need to be able to quantify what's in our plant.
And
So,
I think it's important for people to consider too. It's about repeatability within the lab. If Mary's doing the extractions and she's sick one day and Joe has to do the extractions, their technique and their SOP has to be the same so that the results that are coming out are the same. So that's what we call interlab variation or interday variation. But there's also, variation between labs that we'll see. And part of the problem is that Health Canada has a set of regulations where they say you have to have what's called a validated method. And a validated method is just a way of measuring something where you come out with an accurate result. Like you're actually measuring what you say you're measuring. But nobody holds these labs to account, right? So you actually can have variability between labs because they go about, counting oranges in a different way. One guy is, seeing how much the water level raises when you put, 10 oranges in the water, and someone's just counting them directly, right? So there's different ways to get the same result, and that can be problematic, right? For this consistency across, and we're talking about across an industry.
I 100% agree, guys. We all have different methods of each one of these labs, and it's certainly one of the big issues in the industry, especially with things like THC being such a big topic. So luckily there are starting to become some standards companies that are putting out proficiency testing and starting to help with that. But sample preparation can also have a huge part of that. So I agree.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So, and Daryl, just so I can clarify, are you talking about the Emerald test, or is there another company
So
that started
CALA, Proficiency Testing Canada, is a common
Hmm.
Canadian proficiency testing, and they've recently provided some cannabis, some limited cannabis, but Emerald Test still has a wider range.
Okay. Okay. Thank you for that. Daryl, do you want to tackle this one for
Thanks
us?
to duplicates. I'll let the chemists do that too. That's
Yeah.
Well, we'll run through these quickly so we can get to the good stuff.
Yeah.
But these are all just terms that you're gonna, if you look at a COA or you talk to a lab, you're gonna find these terms come up. And a standard, again, is something that a chemical supplier has purified to a high purity, 99.9% plus. There's primary calibration standards that are highly controlled. That's how you do your primary quantification. There could be secondary check standards that a different lot, a different supplier, just to compare and make sure that the initial calibration is not off. And you can use those for spiking as well. A blank is I hope most people are aware, is kind of a control. If you test the blank, you should get no signal, and if you get a signal, that's a false positive, and that's an important one. You do multiple blanks throughout a run, as well as duplicates. Your method has to be robust enough. Again, going back to repeatability, in order to generate the same data within a run, or throughout the run, or throughout various days. So again, these are all different methods that analytical chemists use in order to make sure that the quality control within a run is good. And if those fail, then your run fails.
So, and all of this that we just discussed, and for those of you who might be at all blurry on the standard, just remember that standards are your point of reference for the molecule that you are trying to measure. So if your standard is not solid, your measurement will never be solid.
Correct.
And that can lead, obviously, if you have, for example, a standard that's overemphasizing the presence of the molecule, it can lead you into a false positive, and conversely, a false negative. We're going to be adding a lot more color to these terms right now, because we actually have some flowcharts for you that will illustrate how false positives and false negatives can happen. And I think we're going to be adding a lot more color to that conversation.
Yeah.
Really want to get to those charts.
Yeah.
Validation data is simply the background data, the raw data that stands behind all of your measurements coming directly out of your machinery, usually in the form of raw chromatograph data. We're going to actually be talking about transparency of that type of data and how important it is that when labs are requested on behalf of a client that they reveal the validation data, that data is, of course, upfront and there for the client to have, because sometimes labs make mistakes. Now, very quickly, there was a question in regards to how sensitive are these devices. And really that depends on what it is that you're trying to measure.
Yeah.
And so limit of detection, to put it in simplest terms, is the determination of that very question, is how sensitive is this piece of machinery according to that particular standard.
Yeah, it's what's the smallest amount of a substance we can detect.
Exactly. The tiniest,
With
Whereas,
confidence. With confidence, right? But that doesn't mean, and that's important, it doesn't mean that you can tell exactly how much it is. That's the limit of quantitation, which is 3 to 5 times higher, 10 times higher than detection. But the difference is limited detection, I know something's there, versus I know something's not there. And that's all it says, right? You're most interested in a limit of quantitation where you can quantify with a certain confidence. And those are, again, often conflated. But we care about LOQs mostly when we look at COAs.
So ring tests are going to be a repeating, again, theme during our discussion, which we're going into right now. And what ring test means basically is that you're sending the same sample, selected in the same manner, randomized selection, hopefully, homogenized in the same manner, sent to to a bunch of different testing facilities. Maybe sometimes you can do internal ring tests. I don't know if that's the appropriate terminology, Tom. Maybe you can correct me. When you're bouncing between different pieces of machinery inside of a lab, okay? Or if you have, for example, a GC as opposed to a full GCMS setup, et cetera, right? Different brand, different standards, right? Cross-checking your results, ring tests, okay? ISO certification and GMP certification is where people are supposed to get slapped, really, because Health Canada is doing a pretty poor job of enforcing their own standards. Whereas GMP and ISO, correct me again if I'm wrong, Tom and Daryl, and you would know too, Ryan, is it an annual checkup? Do they every year checking your methods? They're making you conduct some ring tests? Is that essentially what's happening? You know, I know ISO is more about that, whereas GMP focuses more on process. Is that correct?
I mean, fundamentally, they're just third-party certifications you get from things like CALA in Canada, where basically if you get this certification, you can say with greater confidence to your clients and to the regulators that whatever you're doing from start to finish, from the minute you accept that sample or that standard to when you report that to your client, you're able to trace everything back and forth, capture issues and deviations, correct them properly, and ultimately put out great data. So it's not necessary. Not everyone's ISO certified, but it's a badge of honor. If you're working with a lab, it's probably important that a lab has ISO certification, GMP as well for things like export. That's a little different.
Absolutely. So when we're talking about a testing flowchart right now, we're going into the elucidation of how things go right, how things go wrong, okay? This is where we enter a general conversation. So I'm just going to illustrate sort of what I've put on paper here, and we can each speak to the points and how frequently, how infrequently, how likely, how unlikely, et cetera, these things are. So here's an example when the client and the laboratory are in pursuit of truth. The right intention is there to begin with, meaning that the client has done appropriate randomized sample selection without trying to game their tests by sprinkling some keef on top or only taking the top colas, for example. There at the second step, you'll notice how even when you do perfect sample selection, there's still going to be a certain degree of variability between your randomized sample selection and then what the lab is actually receiving, even if it's slight. So I was very kind there. I put a 0.2 degree of variation, which is, mind you, this is not normal, okay? So this is very well randomized and homogenized sample selection.
Can I just interrupt there and say it's not homogenized. So when you're growing a crop of cannabis, this is going to be a somewhat inaccurate example just for the purpose of the discussion. But the plant that's directly under the light may have a slightly different chemical content than the plant that is 4 across and 3 down in the corner of the room. That's not getting as much light or different airflow or whatever the characteristics are that are causing variation. So even between on those individual plants, the top bud versus the bud that's 2/3 of the way down on the plant and is getting a little bit of shade, they might have a bit of variation in the crop. So when you see a crop that's labeled as 16% total THC, it actually might be anywhere from say 12% to 19%.
Yeah.
And that's a normal type of range that you'd see in like an agricultural product like cannabis. Okay. So when you go into when the grower goes into their container to send samples off to the lab, if they're only going and grabbing the biggest buds that were at the top of the plant and have and all receive the most amount of light, that's what's called a sampling bias or a sampling error, where we're taking individuals out of that group population that don't match the average chemical constituent of that whole bag of weed, right? So it's important. So when growers send samples off to the lab, you really do want to have a representative sample. And unfortunately, the way that the system is set up and the market is set up right now, where people are kind of buying weed based on the high THC content, there's an incentive, unfortunately, for growers to go in and try to manipulate the sample so that they get a higher number, which means they can get a higher return on their investment, right? When they sell the product, they're going to get a higher price.
So I'll tell you why I said that word, Ryan, because it's been my experience, at least, that when you do randomized bud selection, and I said I was incredibly kind with that 0.2% variance only. When you do fully, let's say that you've illustrated really well how people game it. If we try to do it right, and we take a little bit of a top bud, a little bit of a medium bud, a little bit of a bottom bud from this plant, from that plant, all over the room. Try to get as much as you can, get several samples. And you do, well, at least some laboratories that I used to work with would suggest that you take those randomized selected buds and that you actually grind it together, or that they would grind it together at the lab for you. But ground together, it homogenizes the matrix as much as possible.
Yeah.
So that submit into the machine. It's as close as it could possibly be if you're dedicated on your discipline, right?
So in the context of a ring test, and a ring test is typically when you're trying to figure out in an industry, or to figure out who's your supplier going to be, you do a ring test where you send the same product out to multiple laboratories. Okay, in that case, you do want to homogenize the sample, because you want all the labs to get the same material to start with, right? It's not up to the labs to identify the variation within your batch. Really, at that point in time, you're trying to find out, is everybody consistently producing the same numbers when we give them the same thing? And the way that we can give them the same thing is we remove that crop variability by taking, a bunch of buds of different types and grinding it all together and to create one uniform blend. Typically, that's not done on a sampling procedure when growers are looking for a result, right? For regulatory purposes, you have to have the cannabinoid content labeled on the vial. They don't want the average, right? They kind of.
And there's a few more, points I think to drive home. How good your sample is your starting point for the rest of the analysis. If you don't get a good sample, everything else downstream doesn't matter, right? And to Ryan's point, there is inherent variability in a crop. Some crops might be more variable depending on the size of the room and how well the grower has manicured that plant and treated it, and maybe there's localized burning and stuff like that. But ultimately, we know that in any population, I mean, we just went through this with a vote in the States. You have a population, and then you take a poll and you take a sample, and that sample has to be really good. It's not going to be perfect, rarely, especially in this type of environment, but it's got to be good enough for you to capture that variability, because you are ultimately on the label putting one number. You're not putting a range. You're not grabbing 10 samples. And Health Canada, the regulations in the cannabis regulations require you to use approved methods that you have validated or others have validated in order to get that sample. So again, your sample is your starting point. If you take a bad sample and you bias it by taking colas, you're going to lead down a path that maybe is a false positive. If you do a job poorly, then of course the opposite is true. You're going to get an under supply. So that's the first step. But then Ryan, walk us through what happens in the lab. Let's say I'm a grower. I go, I harvest a crop. I have 100 kilos from a room, and I take a 50-gram sample, and then I send it to a lab. So what happens next at that lab?
Well, it depends on the lab that you send it to, right? Which is one of the things. So when there's different ways, we were talking about making the soup before. You put your flowers in your solvent and you extract the flavors, or the cannabinoids and the terpenes. And there's different ways of doing that. There's something called a bead beater, which is essentially you take your sample, you put it in a container, and it's like a paint mixer. It's a machine. It's like a paint mixture. Think of it as a paint mixer with a bunch of marbles or like BBs in the material. And as the paint mixer shakes the container back and forth, these beads float around with the plant material, and they smash the crap out of them and essentially pulverize it into a bunch of cells that are all individually broken apart, and they've released all their content. That's probably the best way to do it, because you're really getting a complete extraction, a complete maceration of all the materials, and they release all their contents. Another lab might just take a whole flower and put it in a test tube in a sonicating bath, which uses like a high frequency vibrator essentially to break apart the resin glands that are on the plant material. Well, we did a whole bunch of tests, and it turned out that the way that you extract the flower actually it can have an impact on the amount of terpenes, for example, or cannabinoids that end up in your mixture. So really what I think we're trying to do in the context is show you that at every point along this process and testing, there's ways that you can have this error, right? This mistake in our measurements.
Yeah.
So
and Yeah.
And you know, it's also like the sampler, the client provides a sample, and that usually is for not only potency testing, but 5, 10 other tests, micro, metals. So the lab will take a subsample of the sample. So how they do that? Do they homogenize it first? They should, but sometimes with micro you can't. You just have to take it as is. That introduces an error. You know, when you grind cannabis, right? You create keef, trichomes fall off, and they settle. So you have settling and separation. And if you take a, you know, let's say a magic bullet and you homogenize your stuff, and then you go, oh, I'm going to take the top 5 grams for potency, you're leaving behind all that good stuff, all that potent keef and trichomes at the bottom. And again, then your next step is your extraction at the lab. Is it 100%? No. Is it 99, 95? Hopefully, could be 80 if you don't do your job right. Every single step of the way, you are introducing error and bias. The whole point is to eliminate that in analytical chemistry, but it's inevitable. And so the question is, what's an acceptable error? When we know the true, let's just say there was a way for us to extract a whole room of cannabis, take a sample of that and say the average content of the room is 16, but you know the lab showed 17.5. To me, that's acceptable. It's you know, to most people it's not. They see 2 numbers, but for most people, I think you have to squint and you have to understand that there's always going to be a 1 or 2% variability, and that's acceptable. That's fine. But
and that's why when you look at a lab report and you see the cannabinoid content or the terpene content that goes down to 3 decimals, you know, it's kind of ridiculous. Like, you know, when you drive from, say, Vancouver to Toronto, you don't measure it in centimeters, right?
Yeah,
because it's just there's no point in doing that. You know,
forget the decimals. You know,
the decimals. I love that part, Tom, that you said the other day. Just
get rid of
now on, people, don't look at your decimals, and remember that 10 to 14% degree variability is within the GMP/ISO parameters as well as Health Canada's parameters. That's completely acceptable. And it's actually kind of a freak occurrence when you submit the same sample and get exactly the same result. I mean down to the decimal point twice.
That's almost suspicious, right?
That's usually we have 1.5%
you know,
5% degree of variance on the same sample and on the same machine, and that's normal. That's part of the pharmacopoeia defined range acceptability.
Yeah.
So,
in other words, 14 is 16 is 18, and that's that, right?
So this was a good test. Let's show them how things can go really, really bad. Okay, this is 2 labs. So we just showed you right now a lab with a good, very knowledgeable, very honest producer. Okay, hold on. This thing is moving on me. And now we're going to show you a producer that's not responsible, so the sample's not being conducted the right way. So with malintent of trying to accentuate THC percent. And then you have a lab that's reacting to a client environment where they know that the client is shopping for the highest THC value. So at every point that they can mess up that percentage and push it up, they push it up. All that's needed is the intent. So let's go through step by step. How does this happen? And again, I've covered it. When you pick your top bud or you sprinkle some keef on it, I mean, that's not too difficult to. We know that we're not in the pursuit of truth there, correct? So when the top bud gets to the lab, it's already 3, 4, 5% off already. That's how big the percentage point off.
Yeah.
Because remember that what we're trying to define during this session, a lot of people are saying that analytics are purely speculative and that it's really just quite useless. And no, hold on. Let's define how speculative it is when you do your job right, and how much can people aggrandize things. And it can get crazy. As you can see here, we've got a flower going from 16% to 23%, hitting the market at 23%. Wow, sounds amazing. So what's happening when it gets to the lab? Help me out, Tom and Ryan. What happens when we get to the lab and these guys, what's going through the head of the lab and how are they messing this up, right?
Well, yeah, theoretically, at the point when it hits the lab, it should be about the discovery of the truth of the number, right? It's an analysis. It's not. People call these things THC scores. They're not scores. You're not running a race, right? It's an analysis. It's an analytical number. We're trying to get a number that represents what's in the flower.
Yeah.
So, you know, we make our soup, we do the extract of the flower, we inject it into our machine. But when we inject it into the machine, we're talking about 1 microliter, so 1/1000th of a milliliter.
Yeah.
And that's a very small amount. And imagine how hard it is when, you know, if you got a 5 milliliter syringe that you're trying to inject something, you know, call ethanol into your car lock on a frozen, you know, winter day. It's very hard to hit like 1 milliliter on a 5 milliliter syringe, right? So you can imagine how difficult it would be on when we're talking about 1/1000th of a milliliter, right? These machines, these injectors that do this, they have to be highly calibrated, and you know that's possible to do, but not labs do it regularly enough, and so you might inject 1.1 milliliters worth of or microliters worth of solvent into the column of the GC. But you've just inflated your cannabinoid results 10% by doing that.
Yeah.
And you know, the one that really kills me, guys, I have to tell you, is the last box when they have the raw data and maybe everybody in the lab did the right thing, but then the person interpreting the raw data says, you know what, I'm just not going to take the average for my curve. I'm going to take the peak, and that's what I'm going to report on. Or this is the one that steers me the wrong way, and I hope some people out there are listening to this one. When they adjust humidity. Now, mind you that when the humidity rating on your COA, all of a sudden, you handed it in at 10.5, 11% MC, and on your result, all of a sudden, you're seeing 4.5%, right? You're going to say, why? Remember that calculation is it's not something that is difficult to avoid. To do that incorrectly, okay? This is a very easy hurdle to get over, but if you choose to interpret your data the wrong way and to skew mass, because that's how remember people, that's how that water thing works. It's not, the equation doesn't work, let me get my bud as dry as I can to testing because then THC is gonna be way higher. It's not really how it works, because any knowledgeable testing individual will know that that can be adjusted mathematically. You know, that this is a function of weight.
Yeah. You know, I don't think, you know, people point to this, people, samplers or companies are over drying their cannabis to increase their potency. Yeah, that's one component. The other is stability, long-term stability, things like mold prevention. The QA guys get involved, and those guys are just jerks from personal experience. But ultimately, when we talk about, you know, a nice fresh bud is going to be between 10 and 12% typically by weight moisture. A over dried bud 6 to 7 and kind of, you know, anywhere in between. So when you go from 12% moisture to 6, it's not that big of a change. I would still think that the sampling error and the potential issues at a lab that suspiciously is consistently high in their cannabinoid reporting is far greater of a problem than that. You know, so obviously when you see a dry COA, yeah, you should be suspicious, but it's reported as is. There's no calculation at the lab. Whatever they get, they get. But it's something to be mindful of. But I honestly don't think that's a huge thing. Personally, I don't know about you, Ryan, but
we have seen recently some results on social media that are from labs in the States, and they're actually, the lab is actually using as a marketing feature the dried result.
Yeah.
So it just to point, like, I don't know how problematic these things are across the industry, but I think the point of what we're talking about today is trying to get people the information so they can understand when they're reading a certificate of analysis that they're looking out for all these things. What type of machine was it done on? You know, is the cannabinoid content measured in a percentage or in milligrams of a compound, right? If it's in milligrams of a compound, like when we analyze something that's 20% THC, let's just throw that number out there. That means that it's 200 milligrams of THC for every gram of cannabis flower, okay? And if that was calculated based at 10% water content, if we reduce that water content to say 2% or even 5% water content, we've now removed 5 milligrams from the total. So it's 50 milligrams from the total.
That's right. Yeah. So it's significant if you go extreme.
Yeah. So it's important that people pay attention to these things. And when somebody hands you a lab report, you don't just go down directly to the THC number and then that's what you're done analyzing the lab report, right? Yeah, you might look at I look at terpenes first, but you might look at cannabinoid content first. But then there's always, then you have to kind of check within the lab report, look for how much flower was sampled, who was the lab that was done. Is it done on a GC-MS? Is it done on a GC-FID? Is it cannabinoids measured on a GC? Is it cannabinoids measured on an HPLC? Because there's preferred ways for doing this. I mean, HPLC is typically more suited towards the analysis of cannabinoids, but some labs choose to do it on a GC, and that's actually not a very good method because you can have destruction of cannabinoids in the column of the GC or even in the injector port. Because they're done at very high temperatures. So it's actually burning off, or the molecule is actually getting destroyed before it even gets to the part of the machine that detects it. And conversely for terpenes, GCFID or GCMS is the preferred way to do terpene analysis, but it can be done on HPLC, but there's certain complications and problems that come with it. So if you think about if you're a commercial laboratory and you've got, so let's say a California laboratory with, hundreds of samples showing up a day, you're trying to run those things all through the laboratory because you're trying to clear the backlog. And the more things you compress into your time period, of your available time period, you're going to start to have a trade-off of accuracy, right? So again,
So just to wrap this up, Brian, when does your skeptical hat go on? When we know from I've looked at large data sets, and I've looked at hundreds of COAs in my life for cannabis, working at a cultivation site, and you've probably seen tenfold that. To me, the average potency of a good quality product is 18 to 20%. I interpret anything over 25 as being extremely high. And I really start to get skeptical and challenge the test if I see anything around 29, 30% and over. What's your opinion on that matter?
Well, my skeptic hat goes on when someone says I have a lab report for you.
Perfect.
Right. And I think that's probably the best way to do it. You also have to understand my context in looking at these is typically in breeding populations, not in repeatable crops of production. Right. Yeah. So I'm looking for that variation within a given crop. So what we do is we identify a given lab or we build our own. We ensure that our method is correct by doing a ring test against many other laboratories. And then we know, okay, within house, this is our range of variability. And then we see the variability. I can actually put faith in the differences between a high yielding or a high cannabinoid plant and a low cannabinoid plant, or same with terpenes, right? But yeah, I think that it's good to be skeptical about every lab report, right? Like,
I mean, you mentioned the states.
And sending your cultivar again and again and again and again and again to the lab before you claim that you know it, because again, like you send in a one COA and people are like, look, my thing is 36%, and I'm like, just send it in again. Verify.
Yeah, and I don't know what we have for time, if we're ending this at exactly an hour or if we can keep going. But okay, because there's a great. Tom's about to bring up the study that was done in the States that Leafly actually did a decent little study for once.
Yeah,
and they've showed that when you look, so when you're building it, when you have thousands of samples going through a laboratory. We can start creating databases of, here's 1,000 results from lab A, here's 1,000 results from lab B, here's 1,000 results from lab C, and we can start taking the averages of the scores from these individual labs. And what this graph is we're looking at here on the bottom of this page here is that there was one lab, and this has been shown repeatedly in every market that is essentially legalized cannabis, that there's always one lab that consistently have a higher lab reporting and it's typically for THC content, but we also see it for terpene contents as well.
So Daryl is the only person here that is actively operating a lab, and I mean, Daryl knows how important it is to not become that blue line in the market, man.
Nope. Well, there's ways to, like you said, to cheat it. And we've been doing our own kind of ring tests with a couple of labs that we've been struggling our head against some of these high THC tests we've seen. And some of it's come down to reporting with moistures, like we spoke about, and not being transparent about the as is with a 28% THC. Others were, after swapping prepared HPLC vials, clear calibration issues. So, you know, and something on a concentrate, a 5-6% calibration difference is a lot. Not so much on a 18% flour, but it all adds up, as you guys showed all those parts to the process. And even sample size, I like to grind at least 10 to 15 grams a sample for a client before we analyze it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And look at that graph. I mean, it's quite clear that whether it's Canada or the States, most of the commercial crops that you see being grown and sold basically don't exceed 30% by dry weight or by weight. I mean, another way to look at it is 1/3 of the plant is one cannabinoid, right? That's pretty impressive. But once you start getting over 25, 30, you are not in the average. You are now in the 10th percentile, the 5th percentile of all cannabis ever tested or grown. It's just it's not impossible. It's doable. You know, obviously cultivars and genetics matter first. Cultivation practices matter second, and obviously sampling kind of wraps it all together. But absolutely, I would advise everyone to be skeptical. I mean, this 18% average is clearly in Canada and the States. You know, 20% above is higher, but anything over 27, 28, you know, I would question very much so the lab's performance. And, you know, at the end of the day, I think Daryl made a comment, integrity matters. Labs that have been around for years and years and years, you can have greater confidence. So when you look at a lab, look at how big they are, how long they've been in operation, what kind of accreditation do they have, and talk to the industry. You know, THC chasing happens from the consumer's perspective, and therefore the province's perspective, and therefore the growers and cultivators perspective. And everyone is just trying to sustain their business, and these market forces tend to cause labs and people to do unethical things or just to conduct poor testing. So, you know, just keep that in mind. And as a lifelong skeptic, be skeptical. You know, it's important.
Yeah, and it's also important to point out that these numbers, we can have, you know, above 30% total cannabinoids in a plant. It is possible.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
But again, those are, like Tom said, those are outliers, right? Those are rare plants that come up occasionally, or from, you know, it might be that one cultivator has found this plant, and on really exceptional crops they hit those numbers. But what you want to do is always look at the context of, you know, wow, we saw a 36% THC plant, or THC acid plant, which is actually really quite high. Your first thought should be, okay, who is the laboratory, right? Mm-hmm. And then remember in your mind that, okay, we got a high result from this laboratory. And then as you analyze another 30, you know, COAs over the next 2 months, pay attention to which labs are consistently having these outliers, right? If every lab that comes out from, or if every result comes out from a specific lab is above 32% total cannabinoids or total THC, I mean, that's pretty bizarre. Yeah. Right. And maybe should be a red flag that there's something going on there. It doesn't mean that they're 100% is, but again, like, this is really about how to interpret lab results so that you as a either a customer or as a grower or as a, you know, someone on the retail end are getting what you think you're getting, right?
The other day when my company CannaReps shared a COA that stunned me, over 40% total cannabinoids, not just THC. It had a huge CBG spike. At first, I really got a bit frustrated because it was one of the labs that I respect the most in the United States, maybe the one I respect the most in the States. And I got a little, it hurt my heart because I was like, oh, I love these guys so much, and they're putting something out that really irks me. And so I got on the phone, I called friends, I texted a bunch of people, and I was like, how can I get more information about these people that claim that there's a crop out there that has 38% cannabinoid? And I think it was Ryan who spoke, I think, to the ownership down there. And the ownership told us, you know what, we've gotten repeat COAs on that crop that are hitting 37, 38 on THC content total. And so that was the moment where I was like, you know what?
And that lab does something called a reprep. When they have a number that comes out as an outlier, they always, when you're doing these samples, obviously, you know, like Tom said, Daryl said, you grind up 15 grams. you might take a gram of that 15-gram grind and put that into your extraction buffer so that you have the rest of the flower still sitting around. So when the lab results come back at the end, if you're hitting a 35, a lot of the labs will send it back to the beginning and say, okay, go reprep that sample and run it again, because we got to make sure that it is what it is. And then keep in mind as well, like, everybody likes to blame the labs. Well, the labs can only analyze what they're being given. Right? If somebody goes in and sprinkles some keef on the flower, there's nothing the lab can do about that. They have to analyze what's given to them, right? And so things like the way you trim a flower, right? How much leaf you take off, how much resin you leave on, like all these things. Did you take the stems out, right? Like all of these things, they can add variability into your laboratory.
Well, sorry, I was just gonna say on that, you're exactly right. We get so much stuff coming the door, we have no idea what it is. And I've even had QAs call me, say, how did I get this 35%? And I said, ask your guys, you must have put keef in it. And of course he finds out they did, but even the QA who sent me the sample didn't realize that. And they were doing it, it was a shake product, and he thought it was gonna be low, and it came back high, right? And he had no idea that it was gonna be. So we do see that, but we have no idea.
Well, I saw one the other day. Someone showed me a COA, and it was from there's a lab in Canada called Keystone Lab, and they're actually a great lab. But they offer this service called the Key Box, which is the extraction actually gets done by the grower at home. And so if you don't have a highly accurate scale, right, even if you're trying to do it right, if you don't have a highly accurate scale, your numbers are going to be off.
Yeah.
But because people can try to get, they want to have a high THC number, so they might put double the amount of flour into the extraction buffer at home and then send that extraction off to the laboratory. And the lab has no way. So we saw this one result, and it was like, I think it was over 50% cannabinoids for a flower extract. And, my friend was concerned about the numbers on the high. But again, that's part of the lab result. Okay, look at the THC number, then go back up. Who is the lab that did the result? Oh, it's Keystone Labs. Okay, was this done in-house by their extraction team? Which actually, if you're selling things in the regulated system, you have to use lab extracted. You can't use home extracted tests, right? Those are for home growers that are just trying to get an idea of what's in their flower, but you can't use that for a commercial purpose.
Yeah.
So again, it's the lab report as a whole is really the COA, the certificate of analysis as a whole, has to be taken as a whole. You don't just look at the THC number and then call it a day, right? It has to be taken in context.
Ultimately, there are some jurisdictions in the States or have been where they actually mandated that the lab had to go and take the sample themselves, because, to me, again, if I see a high lab result, the lab might be to blame if the lab consistently over multiple clients or producers puts that out. But if it's only one client getting really good, really high THC, I would say that that's a sampling thing. And, we're lucky here in Canada. We have a legalized industry, plenty of testing labs. There is nothing stopping anyone from going to the store, getting a potentially 35% product and spending $75 to send it to any accredited lab in Canada and to double check that label. That label and your test results should be off by 2, maybe 3% max. Anything more, and that's an issue. And I've been tempted a lot. I don't want to rattle any chains, but I've been tempted to do that because, again, who benefits most from high THC? Well, the lab, because they're going to get repeat business. The producer, because the province is going to love them. And the government, suspiciously too, because they charge a tax rate based on the THC. So, the government also benefits from high THC content in things like edibles or concentrates. So, again, this image that's on the thing now on the screen, I would just those are 2 results in bars, and those are errors, okay? And on the one on the left, there's overlap. In other words, let's say that was a 19 and 21% a COA. To me, it's the same. Close your eyes and squint. It's the same. Take an average, and that's that. Really, when we exceed the potency difference as well as the potential error, then and only then can we call a lab result different. But I've battled with clients on the extraction side, consumers on the flower side, where I've had people call in when I was working at another company, a client, a medical patient. We had a 19.4% pink kush. And he called in swearing at customer service, swearing at me, and he said, call me back when you guys get something over 20%. And that's it, right? And I mean, you're kind of going, it is 20%. 19 is 18 is 21, and consumers don't get it, but people in this industry, people in QA, highly technical people, still don't get this concept, and it's frustrating.
Yeah, I'm so this session is like an exorcism to me, guys. I'm like releasing my inner darkest spirits through your words. You don't know how much I want to thank you for everything both of you said today. We can't end right now because we're gonna tackle at least a couple of questions because this is too juicy.
Yeah.
But what I need to do though is, because I know I'm gonna piss some people off if I don't do this, I need to do the giveaway right now because we're at the hour marker. Sharon is out there. Sharon is our administrative director for the company. She is going to pick a name out for us and announce the winner of the free tuition for this month's Chronicles. Now, while she's doing that, I'm just going to encourage anybody out there that has a product or a service that might be appropriate for the show to please reach out to us, and we can put up some nice slides for you. We can speak to your product. We definitely need a sponsor. This show is perfectly well suited for it, and it would be great to showcase somebody at the middle. So if you're interested, please reach out to me. I will have a conversation with you personally. Now, our discussion section. Sharon, do we know who the winner is before we move on to our discussion section? Anyone? Because we're still going to take some questions, but Max, now you know how this works. Max, you have to say something right now in that chat box, and you have to let us know that you're still here. Max, are you here? See, if you don't say anything, unfortunately, we have to give away the tuition to somebody else. And it's going to irk me to do this. But, Max is here? No, Max has not said anything. Oh, Lord. Max, it's going to break my heart. You're going to miss your tuition to Living Soil at Home. No, Max. Close, Matthew, but no. What can I say, Sharon? I think it's time for you to draw another name from the hat. I think we're going to do it at 1, on 2, on 3. Max? No, Max. Sorry, Laura. No, you cannot be Max. No, I'm sorry. Sharon? Jonathan with it. Is that how it's spelled? Jonathan. So it's not Jonathan, it's Jonathan. Jonathan here still? Jonathan?
Yeah, he got it. He's there.
Yeah. Jonathan, congratulations. You have won the free tuition. I congratulate you, sir. We shall reach out to you at the end of this session. Now, I don't know how busy Tom and Ryan are, as well as Daryl. Can we do a couple of questions before we part ways?
Yeah, absolutely.
We can? Okay, fantastic. We're going to carry on then. Again, Sharon's going to be reaching out to you, so congratulations. What is an acceptable degree of error, and how do we currently define that? It was on the slide, so this question's a little bit redundant. 10 to 14% is usually what's denominated in typical regs. Do either one of you talk more to that shortly, or no?
I mean, I would say 20% plus or minus. And let's make this point because somebody asked it earlier. If you get a COA that says 20% total cannabinoids, we're talking about 20% variation, and that's probably high. I mean, 10 to 15%, call it wiggle room on either side. So that would be plus or minus 3% cannabinoids. So it would be a range of anywhere from 17 to 23.
Yeah.
And I think that's a good context to keep in mind when you're trying to interpret these when you interpret these results. If it says 30 on the package, that doesn't mean that every bud that you're getting out is 30, right? No. It's like there's going to be some wiggle room. Yeah, maybe some is a little bit more, some is a little bit less.
Yeah. And so in that error is, just to be clear, on a relative base, not 20% plus minus, like Ryan says, 20% of 20%. But just imagine we're talking about flowers. We're talking about 10 to 25% potency. When we're getting into extracts, we're getting into the 70s and 80s, right? So imagine a 10% error on an 80% extract. What does that mean? 72 to 88%. In other words, if you get a COA and it's 72 and you get another one that's 88, technically, that would be interpreted, that should be interpreted as the same result. Now, clients don't like that. Provinces don't like that. Extraction clients don't like that when you're talking about efficiency. But this is the reality we live. We'd want to ultimately be able, as an industry, to get away from such a large error and go down to 10, maybe 5%. But realistically, like Ryan said, I would agree, plus minus 20% is good enough for me. And that's, I'm not going to worry too much. But you should be skeptical if you send the same sample, especially homogenized, to the same lab, and you control those variables, and the lab starts giving you huge variability. That's when you should start going, you know what, I think there's an issue with this lab. Because technically, if you did an extraction yourself and you've sent that homogenized oil, which is a lot easier to sample representatively just by mixing, that lab should nail it every time to a much lower error. But if that lab isn't doing that, then
one thing I'll say to that though is we're actually doing a lot of triplicate testing on people's extracts because we are seeing 10% variations, and they're saying it's the same lot, but we're finding out that there's a large amount of variation in their lots. So, and we know it's the same people every time. Like certain stuff comes in, and we're like, okay, it says there's a 0.5% RSD when we test it 3 times, and then the next time, this guy, same guy, it's like 8% RSD, and there's that huge variation of 8% THC in their samples. And we usually contact them and let them know and look for new samples.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I was going to say that too. I mean, it's probably good protocol. In some industries, they do triplicate testing, right? Mm-hmm. And so for extracts, that might actually not be a bad idea that you do multiple samples from a given lot. And obviously, that comes at a cost to both the consumer of the lab services, which is the producer, but also it has a cost implication for the lab. I think another thing that's really important to understand. When you say, let's, again, just throw out the number 25% THC on a flower, or total THC on a flower, the way that you roll the joint, how loose it is, how fast it burns, what types of filter it puts is in the joint, how deeply you inhale, how long you inhale, how long you hold the smoke for. All of these things have a much bigger effect than the amount of variation that you're going to see in a lab report. Yeah. Right. And so it's kind of, I think part of the reason that we do this testing is obviously based on regulations. Health Canada and the regulator wants, they see it as a safety issue. And if we were talking about alcohol consumption, or alcohol percentages, there is a big difference between a 10 and 15% alcohol. But that, I think that the true difference in, when you drink alcohol, you're drinking it all, you're going to get the same dose. Whereas the way that you smoke and the way that you roll, and whether you're using a pipe or a joint or whatever, those things really have a big implication on how much of that THC is actually being delivered to your system. And from the research that I've done, which is, it's not insignificant, I think that those factors are actually quite a degree larger than the amount of variation you're going to see either within the crop or from between labs. Right. So,
Ryan, how many milligrams per puff do you think a person gets off of a standard flower as opposed to a standard extract? I've heard so many scientists, friends of mine, debate this so much. I'm in the 1 to 2 milligram range for flower. What do you think?
I don't think we have proper data to really even be able to do that. I mean, a friend of mine, Arno Hazekamp, was a Dutch cannabis researcher. He used to work with Bedrocan BV years ago. And he actually did some of these studies where they took cannabis and they went, in the tobacco industry, they have these smoking machines essentially, so that they can test, all these things. And he took cannabis over to this tobacco company smoking machines, and they rolled a bunch of joints and put them to the machine. And what they do is they put filters in line with there's essentially a vacuum that's puffing the joint, right? Or puffing the cigarette. And they have these filters in line which actually catch the cannabinoids or the smoke. And then those things can be taken and extracted just like we would flour and run through an HPLC. there's all this variation that, again, like we're talking about, there's all this variation that can be put into the process based on a whole number of factors. So if you really think that you need to be dosing cannabinoids to the milligram, people should be looking at one of those like psych devices. There's something called psych. It's SYQE. So people can look that up if they're interested. But it's a device that's kind of like a little vape device, and it gives you standardized doses of cannabinoids. One of the beauties about cannabinoids is that they have quite a large therapeutic window before they start giving you toxicity. So, and they're relatively benign substances compared to, say, opioids or some of these other drugs that we take that actually have toxicity. So you can actually consume them safely. And if you're supposed to take 5 milligrams and you take 50 milligrams, it doesn't really matter. The only effect that you're going to have is psychoactive. It's not like you're going to start putting your liver in danger or your kidneys in danger, because you're taking a large dose. So it's kind of one of the beauties of cannabis, and I think that we're finally starting to see that reflected in things like today. The UN removed cannabis from the 1961 Single Convention, or at least Section 4. So it's starting to come around, but I think that really people should keep in mind these things when they're talking about analysis and percentages and all that kind of stuff. I'd like to really see people move away from percentages and more on to milligrams, but or at least to understand that those two numbers are correlated, right? Because one of them is misleading. It can be misleading.
Yeah, that's part of the training in our course. I hope that any of my students could get put on the spot. What's 15%? Tell me what it is. No, I'm kidding. What type of repercussions could labs / producers face if caught gaming their COAs? And how common is this, do we think? None of us know. What's our perception,
The cannabis regulations require labs to use validated methods, but Health Canada that licenses the labs does not check them. So it's up to the producer, the client, to do that. So there's a sequence of events that has to happen when you validate a new lab. You review their certificates and you do some maybe testing. But there's also sampling requirements. Again, Health Canada just says you just need to do a proper sampling during inspections. They will review your sampling procedures and your records. But again, it's not super regulated. There have been instances, especially in the past, when Health Canada is doing way more inspections. Like producers used to get inspected monthly. Now it's almost annually, over 5 years later. But you have to keep retention samples for all your products. And so if Health Canada comes in and says, hey, that crop you sold 2 months ago, I need that retention sample, and they're going to do a test. And if it comes back different, then the first thing you have to say is, well, my lab is validated, and here you go, here are the documents, and it's kind of a done deal. But there have been instances where there have been recalls for as little as 1 or 2% variability on the label because a producer tested themselves using unvalidated methods or perhaps poor methods. So it could range from a slap on the wrist to a recall to a license suspension. Because again, the CRA is now involved. The CRA gets their cut from the fund tax, the sin tax, totally based on THC, and pricing as well. It could be a business issue, right? I mean, if you sell me something and you claim 25%, and I send it to 3 labs and I see 13, which has happened to me before as an extractor, that's an issue, right? You just shorted me half of the product, and we have to resolve that. So Ryan can probably add to that, but ultimately there are a lot of repercussions, but I don't see it happening a lot.
Yeah, I mean, we saw what happened with CanTrust. I don't think we're going to be pulling lab results, unfortunately. But I think that, we do need to do a ring test, and maybe, Tom, you want to be part of that. But we do, as an industry, need to have some ring testing done between the samples. There's all these NDAs, between non-disclosure agreements between labs and processors and everybody, and what ends up happening is the information doesn't really leak out to the clients, or to the consumers, right? But I think that as an industry, we need to have more clarity, more transparency in this area, and some independent lab or independent ring testing of labs with the same samples, I think would actually be really eye-opening.
Yeah, and to have the government behind it, not just independent councils, right? To actually have some weight behind it. So,
well, the government can only react to the information that they have, and they're just not collecting that type of information, right? So I think that once, you know, we've seen it in other aspects of the industry. Once these things become talking points for the industry, the regulator is not blind, and I don't think that they're stupid, you know. I think that when they see things that need to be acted on, that they will act on them.
They will. Slowly, but they will.
the way that we do things in Canada, my friend.
That's right.
How can an average consumer derive value from interpreting COAs with everything we've talked about? Now we know that there's some degree of variation there that needs to be considered. What do you said, Ryan, you said you look at terpenes first. Yeah.
You know, everything you're going to see on the market is pretty much a type 1 or THC dominant plant. So, I come from the cannabis world pre-lab testing, and the way that cannabis was purchased was always done by the nose. It wasn't done by, if someone said, well, you showed up to buy some weed and someone said, I've got these 5 types, you'd stick your nose in the bag and say, I want that one. Right. And that didn't tell you anything about the THC content. I've used this analogy 100 times, but we don't buy alcohol based on, you don't buy liquor, you don't buy fine wines based on their alcohol content. And even whiskey, you don't buy based on alcohol content. Like, I've never ever seen someone go into a liquor store and say, which whiskey has 45% alcohol, or which wine has 18% ethanol, right? It's just not the way that it's done. And so for me, the real interest comes from the different types of scent in the flower. And so when I look at a lab report, the first thing I look at is what's the terpene content, to see if it even makes sense. What are the top 3 or 4 terpenes? What are the dominant terpenes? How much of those are in there?
Yeah.
Does that even really make sense in the context? And here's another thing: like, if you want to look at a lab, want to look at a lab report, one thing I always want to see on a lab report is a picture of the product that got analyzed. Yeah. Right? Because you can pretty tell, like, sometimes you get a lab report with 32% THC acid. It's a really high number. Yeah. And you look at the flower and it's all brown and schmangly and just like terrible looking bud. And there's just like, no way, right? But that should be part of, any really good lab report, is a picture of what was analyzed, right? So, because again, it's the lab report as a whole. Is it internally consistent as its own document, right? And you'll start to, when you read, when you see 100 of these things, or even 1,000, you really start to see some and you're like, oh, this is nonsense. Mm-hmm. And you can just kind of toss them, right?
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. THC, most of the products out there are high THC. There's no differentiation when it comes to that. Now, obviously, as a consumer, if you're looking for something that's lighter or less potent, obviously a COA or a label that says 10% is going to be a different effect than something that's 22 or 25. It goes out saying. But 16 is 18 is 20. You shouldn't be making a decision primarily based on decimals or even the last number, the 1 or 2 or 3, slight variations. Terpenes do matter. Ultimately the nose knows. I think there could be a way where, you purchase enough cannabis and you have enough access to the terpene data to know that you like a certain proportion of terpenes or a certain type of terpene, right? If you like terpinolene, which is a more rarer terpene in commercial kind of products in Canada, then you're going to be looking for that on the COA. But look at moisture, and you're right. A picture is worth 1,000 words, and to my knowledge, almost no one is showing pictures of the exact lot or the sample that was tested, and probably because some producers wouldn't want that because of how long it takes to go from harvest all the way to market, which can be upwards a year, and again, introduce more variability that way. Right?
In Canada, they're not.
No, in Canada,
in other markets they do. So
yeah.
Again, this is in Canada, we're ahead in so many ways in terms of legalization. We're really the cutting edge. But in other ways, in terms of market maturity, we're actually way behind other markets. So I'd like to see that. I'd like to see, that as part of any COA. And look, it's a pain. It's like, that means every lab, when it comes in, the first thing they have to do is it goes into a process where it's photographed, and that photo then is attached into their back end of the computer for that whole sample, and it follows it all the way through the lab report. So it is an extra step that they have to take, but it's not. I don't think it's a bad idea.
No. And again, bias sampling makes that whole point moot. If you take the nicest, frostiest, best looking buds and send it to the lab, and then you open your package and it's a bunch of popcorn buds, you're going to be even more pissed, right? So there's pros and cons to both. I think ultimately, as a consumer, you should approach it by initially sampling a variety of different products based on maybe some reviews, some third-party reviews you trust, and then honing in on a few select producers and products and hoping that they stay consistent. And that's ultimately the best you can do. But take everything with a grain of salt because of all the issues we discussed.
Yeah, and stuff comes up. I mean, I know people get so frustrated with all this variability, and they just want numbers that are accurate. And I think, one of the important things to take away is that it's maybe it's not as important as having it as accurate as we think it is, but also understanding that stuff happens, and we have, we have safeguards in the system. For example, something that just came up in the last few months, we were talking about these standards that they use to calibrate the machines. And so typically when you buy a standard, or at least in the United States, and I think it's quite global, even if you have THC and it's a restricted chemical, you're allowed to have 1 milligram of THC diluted in 1 milliliter of methanol. And the reason they use methanol is because it's toxic, and the idea is that people won't consume that 1 milligram of THC.
You got to think of the children, Ryan.
Right, to protect the children. But the interesting thing is one of the lab suppliers that supplies these standards to a vast majority of the labs in the industry has just come out and said one of our recent batches wasn't, it was supposed to be 1 milligram, and it turned out that it was 0.94 milligrams.
I think it was 0.85.
Well, this has happened multiple times.
Okay.
We're talking about the same things.
Yeah.
But yeah, it does happen that they miscalculate, that they misformulate the standard, and that means that everybody downstream that use those standards to calculate the laboratories, and like we said, it's a significant part of the industry. That means that all of their results from using those standards were wrong. And did anybody die? No, right? It's not really a safety issue, but it's to understand that, like, when, especially in the context of looking at lab reports with either THC or terpene analysis down to like 3%, three decimals.
Yeah,
it's kind of ridiculous in the context of we don't even know if the standards are pure, right?
Yeah.
And where does all this ridiculousness come from? It comes from, in my opinion, the fact that we're working in a system that's still thinking of a product as a pharmaceutical product in a medical context where medical practitioners have never learned to use natural products as medicine. There's no history of that. There's no background in that. So there was for a very long time. But now the standards of purity for pharmaceutical grade products are just of a different nature than what a plant that grows like a vegetable does, and how it works in the body and how people derive benefit from it. So I think it's this big, crossing of cultures, where this is something that derives it. You get both pleasure and the medical effect from those terpenes being there. For example, I've had so many people tell me, Adolfo, medical users don't need high terpene content. They don't need stuff that's aromatic. They just need stuff that's accurate and repeatable. And I say, I'm a patient. And if you give me stuff that's flavorless, it's not going to treat my pain. I'm telling you right now, because I've been smoking cannabis my whole life for pain. And I'm telling you, if I don't have a sufficient amount of aroma that's in line with the type of aroma that my body needs, I'm not going to get the medicinal benefit from it. Yeah. So I think that, there's this big intersection of culture.
And the other thing we have to consider, on one hand, from a medical context, pharmaceutical context, accuracy is important for sure.
Of course it is.
Right? Doses matter. The dose creates the effect, so to speak. But we also have to realize that we are working in a production system in Canada that services two retail markets, right? So the same grower, the same extractor, the same processor is formulating or growing or putting products out to the medical side and the rec side. And of course, Canada is very strict in its regulations, and the rec side is basically presented in such a way that it's put against the medical kind of sphere that started this whole thing. So you know, it's good that production is unified. It allows from a business perspective, it allows you to have different markets and serve those markets without changing up too many things. But also for a grower or processor looking to service only the rec market, where the consumers might not be so picky or even care, their hands are still tied by this strict medical framework that this country started down the path in. So I don't think that's a bad thing. Ultimately, we want the tests to be accurate. We want them to be representative, and we want them to give us information. But we have to realize that there's errors in this testing, and it doesn't tell the whole story. And it's just a starting point, right? 5% is different than 20%. You're going to know, you're going to experience the difference in that effect. But don't start looking at the second decimal spot and going, my stuff's better than yours. It's just not the case.
Yeah,
beautiful summary there. Beautiful. How common is it for LPs to request tests that go beyond the Health Canada requirements? Like, how many people are testing flavonoids? And I mean, water activity, everyone tests for it, but how many people even ask for it? How many people are requesting it?
Daryl, this is all you.
Daryl, what do you think? I know he's out there. Maybe you're still on mute, Daryl. We can't hear you.
Yeah, I mean, I would say LPs are terpenes are on the rise for sure. That is one of the biggest growing tests that everybody's looking for. With chasing the THC, it's that total terpene value, which is an objective value. And like Ryan says, the nose should be what leads people in their products, but these QAs need those values to sell their product. Water activity is becoming bigger, but it's almost a better indicator of storage than moisture, right? But I don't know more LPs do it, but they don't. The only other thing we're seeing probably a big uptake in is everybody's getting like a visual inspection. It doesn't come with a picture at this point, but there's a lot more interest on us putting more information on there. The issue is it's an objective test with telling them, it's this color, it has this smell, and it looks like this. So a lot of people want to see it like we see in these US COAs, but at the same time, they're also afraid that it's going to sort of position the product differently or make their product not desirable based on something we might put on the COA. So some standardization there would be nice, I think.
So what I gather from your response is that not too many people are asking for water activity or flavonoids yet. It's some terpenes,
yeah, no flavonoids, just terpenes,
obviously,
right?
But yeah.
Yeah, a lot of I don't think that flavonoids are really that important to put on. I think, if you're flavonoids we're talking about, really they're these tiny molecules that you see at higher presence in like germinating seeds, for example, than in flowers, right? In like seedlings. So I think that in the context of where people are going to get flavonoids into their system, it's going to be through eating like hemp sprouts, not through smoking cannabis, right? I don't think there's any evidence that flavonoids are even delivered into the system through smoking a joint, right? So it's kind of pointless to be talking about those things. It's a kind of a buzzword because people think that flavo means flavor, right? But that's not the root word. It's just a common misconception.
It comes from Flava Flav, actually.
Yeah.
Oh shit.
So, and the water activity is being measured a lot by that. That's actually, I see that a lot at LPs. They're doing the water they're measuring water activity as part of their their sampling or their drying procedures. So it's hard. I don't know again how crucial it is, because again, we're talking about an order of months between analysis and the time it's rolled up in your joint, right? So how relevant is it really to have it on the?
Well, it's not for the. I wasn't inquiring so much for the label on that one. It's more so for the curing process, refining your SOPs, in-house protocols. to ensure that you're chasing perfection, not just setting it at 10% MC and just
Well, and
forget.
this is part of the problem with commercial lab testing, right? To me, commercial lab testing should be done for batch releases, but good processors and good cultivators is not, I don't mean for micros because it doesn't make sense for them to do it, but if you're an LP of a significant size, you should be doing all this testing within house yourself. And then it should be confirmed by an independent third-party laboratory, and that's the number that goes on the packaging, right? Because the reason to have a third-party lab is that then it's not you making claims about your product, it's a third party that's certifying that your product is X.
Yeah.
Right. So yeah.
Yeah, that's bang on. You need to, especially like you said, micros are going to be highly skilled people that were already killing it. They know tactilely when to stop their cure. If you're a big company and you've got a massive facility with a ton of employees and you're expecting each one of them to have that sensibility for when to stop the cure, hell no, man.
Yeah.
Set your MC at 13.5, stop your cure at 13.5, then start doing some slow release of the rest of the moisture before you package, and you're going to maximize your aroma, people. Remember that you learn all of that stuff during our course, but I like to reinforce it every time I get a chance because, man, so many of my LP clients are setting the 10% MC, which is the agricultural standard. And I said to them, "God, yeah, not this agricultural product, please. Don't grow your beautiful cannabis and then zap your monoterpene like that. Don't do that to your cannabis, for God's sakes." Do we agree with Health Canada testing requirements, all of them, including CFU counts? And how do you think this comes to bear on the overall quality of regulated products? This is the last question. We're tying it up now. This is it. Summary time.
Well, let me start by being the guy who has to deal with Health Canada regularly as part of my job for the last 6 years. From Health Canada's perspective, Health Canada has never cared about the quality of your cannabis in terms of consumer preference, right? They're getting better at it. Inspectors, after a few years, are starting to realize what a healthy cannabis plant looks like versus not, what a good plant looks like versus not. But ultimately, that's not what they're there for, right? They're not there to comment or make sure that you have the dankest weed or the nicest stuff. I mean, some inspectors definitely know more than others, but ultimately they're there to protect consumer safety, right? So they care about things like pesticides or heavy metals or aflatoxins, pretty much, and microbial counts, right? But again, the regulations have evolved from a medical perspective. When you have to pick your release criteria, you don't do it out of thin air. You have to do it according to an acceptable pharmacopoeia, the US pharmacopoeia or European pharmacopoeia. And those pharmacopoeias talk about natural or herbal or even conventional drugs. Therefore, those criteria are especially strict. They cater to the immunocompromised. They cater to the sick, the people who if they were to take some spore and inhale it and get sick, that's who they cater to. They don't cater to the average person, and as a result, we have a very, very strict testing criteria. Most of these criteria are not hard to meet. Pesticides, I think we can all agree we should probably limit the use of pesticides in general. And especially on things that are burned and inhaled. Heavy metals, not a huge issue. You control your inputs, it's fine. Aflatoxins, never have seen it, not an issue. Microbes, recently, you have to test against how you're using the product, and they've become very strict. And I have concerns because I don't think we need to go that strict on cannabis. A simple way to look at it is we've been using cannabis for thousands of years, and most of the time it's not an issue, right? We should have a separate stream for medical patients and different products, but ultimately the average person doesn't need that level of sterility, and yet everyone's going to have to meet that. So what is that going to lead to? Drier product, irradiated product, less flexibility in how you store it. So the consumer ultimately pays the price, and as the industry, we are obligated. Our consumers deserve the best. A lot of investment has gone on in here, and our hands are often tied, and it's not going to work out well for everyone. So I do hope that
Yeah, we need to push back on that. There needs to be an organized, concerted pushback, because we, again, and listen, cannabis was legalized because of medical cannabis. Let's be frank about it. And that was incredible, but it also brought a lot of problems because it was medicine, right? Yeah. We fell into a system that for good reason needs to be highly regulated. I mean, most molecules aren't like THC. They don't have the therapeutic window that cannabis does. And you can blow right through that window and hit toxicity quite easily, and start causing health damage just by taking, these simple compounds that comes out of plants. But to look at the legalized cannabis recreational market through that lens definitely ties our hands in a bunch of ways. And I think this thing that's coming where they're going to further tie our hands by making these things, it's not based in reality. And if we need to do those things for truly medical markets, for people that have compromised immune systems and all and whatever, I have no problem with that. But I think to tighten up and make us have to irradiate everything is just really nonsense.
Yeah, again, no one's making anyone irradiate, but
they're creating
explicitly, but by definition, trying to achieve. Imagine you're a large, even micro grower, and you have one large room, and you have, your air conditioner breaks for a night, and all of a sudden, your levels of your microbes grow beyond what's acceptable. You're going to be forced to do something to irradiate that product. Now, I want to be clear, because I see a lot of comments about irradiation, right? There's electron beam ionization and there's gamma irradiation. They differentiate by the energy levels and the type of particles that are used. Done right, electron beam ionization on a decently moist but not overly moist crop will have very, very minimal impact on terpenes. It will have impact, but not as much as people think. I've seen lab results from multiple ionizations where the terpenes, especially the heavier ones, don't change too much. Obviously, the more aromatic ones will boil off. The issue with irradiation,
really important ones, just to point them.
Yeah.
But
especially with the gamma.
But again, it's not.
Yeah,
gamma can. I mean, we've all seen producers use gamma and just absolutely microwave the heck out of their stuff. But the big thing is when you irradiate something that's wet, something that's moist. From personal experience, I've seen this time and time and again. Those buds come back a little browner, a little yellower, a little more pale. So what happens? QA or customer service says, our customers don't like that. Go drier. So QA starts going, well, let's dry the heck out of this stuff. It's only going to increase potency. It's only going to increase shelf stability. And therefore, the irradiation will have much of an impact on the physical appearance. So this is a scenario we have now, that we have over-dried cannabis that continues to dry when it sits on a shelf in the warehouse and in a truck and in the retailer for up to a year or more. And nothing wrong with it. No one's becoming some kind of alien because they're utilizing irradiated cannabis, but it's an extra cost, it's an extra process, it's extra time, and it really does impact the quality of the cannabis. Not maybe significantly all the time, but not it's not negligible,
Tom, I think you were bang on with the E-beam, and I think a lot of people get that really bad rap because of the Cobalt 60 gamma machines.
Yeah.
This is the thing though that I want people to know. With the change in regulations, E-beaming will not be enough oftentimes, because E-beaming zaps the exterior of your bud, but it does not penetrate the way that gamma does. So unfortunately, with a change in regulations, E-beaming oftentimes will come back to you after you do your micro testing, and you're going to have to zap it with the gamma, even though a lot of these LPs don't even own it right now, right? Yeah. Because those standards are getting adjusted to be even lower than what they are now. Yeah. So I really want students to walk away with 2 points here. If you think that radiation zaps all terpenes and that there's no terpenes left behind, that's not accurate. But any company telling you that even E-beaming does not sacrifice some of your monoterpene layer is also lying to you. Likewise,
it does.
Daryl, I really want to get your input here.
Oh, Brian,
he's bouncing back in right now. I don't know what happened to him. Daryl, you still there? There he is. You're mute still, Daryl. Still. He's on permanent mute. Okay. Well, anyways, I just want to make sure that students walk away knowing that irradiation is a fact of life in a regulatory framework like this. You need to have it as part of your repertoire. Even if you're a killer grower, you're going to need to have it as part of your repertoire for remediation. Remediation, remember, fancy word for treating your product when it has a pathogen development, okay? So again, please remember, people, that if anybody's telling you, oh, my company has an in-house publication where we demonstrate that there's absolutely no terpene degradation, because I've seen these publications come out of LPs that I'm not going to name. It's bullshit. There's a visual change. There's an aromatic change, even if it's minorly quantifiable at laboratory level. Olfactory and consumption-wise, it is perceptible. Although, like Tom was saying, with E-beam, you go light on a crop that doesn't have heavy pathogen, and you can end up with something that's glorious.
Yeah.
So E-beam,
and if you start with a very, very nice aromatic plant and all your processes are good, then it shouldn't matter too much. But if you grow a crappy crop, you store it for 6 months, it's over dried, and then you shoot it, way more than you need to, you're gonna have some negative impacts, and the consumers won't be happy. So it's not a band-aid. It's inevitable, especially for export. Sometimes you have to do it. For medical patients, you might want to do it. I just think that, Health Canada needs to realize that, if it expects that, it should expect that for the medical side, because by definition, we should have stricter limits for medicine, of course, right, than the average consumer. But for regular recreational adult use consumption, probably not necessary, but it's a helpful tool to have as well if you do get up there with microbe counts.
I will just add to that as a patient, it's traumatic to me to think that the government will never use total terpene content as evaluation metric, and that they will never focus on providing to patients like myself a product that's actually medicine, because products that don't have monoterpene and only sesquiterpene mostly are not actually medicine to me. And I'm sure that many of you out there, if your product is not flushed right, all of these parameters that the government is not even looking at, you put that as medical product, that came out of my medical jar, doesn't burn right, doesn't have no terpene, and you're calling that medicine to me, that's a faulty system of regulation that we need to challenge.
The problem with saying that is that there's no scientific basis currently that says that terpenes are medicinal in cannabis, and the regulator has to go on evidence-based processes. So
I hear you. I
kind of agree with what you're saying, but it's tough to say it's not medicinal for me, right? To me, those are like connoisseur descriptors rather than medical descriptors, right? So while I agree with you, I think that we got to be careful with the wording of that kind of thing, right?
And I think we should also be grateful that we do have a free market, in the sense that other than how you brand or market it, Health Canada or the federal government doesn't necessarily say you can't do that. You can't release that product. They're very hands off. As a processor, as a cultivator, they can't really tell you which fertilizers you use, or you can't use, as long as they're meet certain quality standards. But at the end of the day, it's not a bad system. It's the onus is on the producer and the consumer to kind of find that shared love and find something that works for them. And I will say that as part of the new regulations, the Cannabis 2.0 products, they expect cannabinoids and terpenes to be consistent within a batch. So that's a big thing, right? So at the very least, when you're formulating something, they expect not only cannabinoids, but they've recognized that terpenes do matter to people, and they expect consistency within, a certain error for the product. So there's progress. It's slow. It took 6 years to get that one sentence in, but here we are, right?
The grounding voice of science.
That's right.
Is emitted from both of you.
Well, it just means that we need to do the science.
Thank you both.
It doesn't mean that the things that you're saying aren't true. It just means that we need to do the science that backs them up. Right? We need to investigate those things.
Yeah.
No, you're so and part of the problem is that Health Canada, for example, you need to have LPs, license holders. They need to have a specific license to do which was really organoleptic testing or self-administration, right? And so you can't actually, under a controlled setting, give people, you know, a known batch of cannabis. It has to be done through a university, and it's kind of ridiculous the way it's set up. So
Ethics committee approval.
I am very close to getting that approval, so I invite you
well,
both
that's
to be my
great.
guinea
Well,
pigs
it just
soon.
means that now that we're having that licensing process, that we can start to collect these types of data, right? And there's many, there's so many studies that, like, in terms of consumption and terpene profiles, and you know, even basic stuff like, can people tell the difference between these two cultivars, to really investigating these deeper things like we're talking about, really specific terpenoid to feeling, right? Or a perception or experience. So yeah, we got work to do. It just means there's all this fun stuff that we still have to learn, right?
I think we're gonna do a whole session dedicated to COA interpretation on another occasion, where we look at the available data and the kind of actual solid things that we can say based on the available data. Because you open up a whole can of worms there, Ryan, that we need to check out.
Well, we should do that. I mean, it would be good to have. Let's look at 10 different COAs and find some that have, you know, weird outliers, things that are questionable, you know, like, and go through them, and just kind of teach by example. That might be a good way to do it.
I can provide a few myself.
There'll be lots of redaction, and we'll redact things right out.
Absolutely.
I want both of you on for that show, and I'm gonna arrange that probably for the February or March edition.
Wicked.
So I'll be reaching out to you for that. And to all of our public, today we did basically a double session, special edition, twice as long. Gracias to everyone for being so patient with us and for giving us your time and attention. I hope that you derive as much value and joy as I did from this session. I want to thank both of you, as well as Daryl, who's now gone, from the bottom of my heart for giving me so much time, so much of your time and your energy. Thank you so much. You guys are a wealth of knowledge. Thank you,
Adolfo. Appreciate the invite, and Ryan, always good to chat with you as well.
Yeah, you as well, and thanks for having us. I really appreciate the conversation too. Always great hearing your perspectives.
Absolutely.
And Daryl as well. You know,
yeah,
really
Daryl
smart guy.
gone, but thanks, Daryl, and everyone else listening. Thank you so much, and feel free to connect with us. You know, I think Ryan and Adolfo and I are both. All of us are on Twitter and freely available to kind of keep chatting. So happy to do it.
Please follow us. We're always out there debating each other and having a good time.
That we are.
I'll see you in a couple of months, guys, okay? And for the rest of my students, I will see you next month for sure, and during our continuing education session. I really look forward to picking up on our speciation debate that we left off last time. Thank you both, guys, and see you everyone soon. Hasta luego. Gracias.
Ciao, hasta luego.
Hasta luego.
Wave, but I wave, okay? I'm Mexican, and this is what we do.